It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Arthur Morgan laughed as he splashed red wine across Alexandra Blake's modest dress in front of the entire press corps. The deep crimson liquid bloomed across the cream-colored silk like a fresh wound, the cold moisture seeping through to her skin. For a moment, the only sound in the gilded ballroom of the plaza was the rhythmic, mechanical whir of a dozen cameras capturing her humiliation from every angle. He didn't offer a napkin. Instead, he handed the empty glass to Thomas Morgan, who stood just behind his father's shoulder, a mirror-image sneer fixed on his face. The heavy, cloying scent of lilies from the centerpieces felt suffocating as Arthur stepped closer, invading her personal space. 5 years away hasn't made you any less clumsy, Alexandra, he said, his voice carrying easily to the edges of the room. He adjusted his silk tie, the diamond pin on his lapel catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. But then again, the Blake family always did have a talent for making a mess of things. Embezzlement, disgrace, and now this. It's almost poetic. Alexandra didn't flinch. She felt the sting of the wine, the weight of the collective gaze of the city's elite, and the pitying look from Sarah, her former assistant, who stood among the staff. She kept her hands steady, her fingers brushing the small, inconspicuous clutch she held against her side. Inside that bag was a smartphone currently receiving a live encryption key, the final piece of a digital puzzle 5 years in the making. "I apologize for the mess, Arthur," she said, her voice a calm, low vibration that stood in stark contrast to his performative booming. "It seems I've forgotten how slippery things can get at the top." Thomas snickered, leaning in. "You shouldn't even be here. This is a celebration for people who actually matter. Morgan Pharmaceuticals is about to finalize the Wilson biotech merger. Why don't you go find a dry cleaner, if you can afford one?" Alexandra's gaze shifted past the two men. At a nearby table, Jerome Wilson sat watching the exchange. The veteran CEO of Wilson Biotech didn't join in the laughter. His eyes, sharp and calculating, met hers for a fraction of a second. He gave a nod so subtle it was almost invisible, a silent acknowledgement of a secret they both held. Arthur noticed the direction of her look and scoffed. "Don't bother looking for sympathy from Jerome. He has no time for charity cases. He knows that the Morgan name is the only thing keeping this industry afloat while your father's legacy rots in a prison cell." He turned back to the press corps, spreading his arms wide to invite the cameras back to his heroic profile. "Let this be a lesson. In this city, you are either the hammer or the nail. And the Blakes, they were barely even the sawdust." The crowd erupted into polite, sycophantic laughter. Alexandra watched him, really watched him. She saw the slight tremor in his hand that he masked by gripping his lapel. She saw the desperation for relevance behind his arrogant posturing. He thought he was the master of this ballroom, the king of the mahogany-lined boardrooms that gave this chapter its name. He had no idea the guillotine was already being polished. She felt a vibration in her clutch, 3 short pulses. The encryption was complete. The sleeping lion was no longer dreaming. "You're right about one thing, Arthur," Alexandra said, stepping back just enough to clear the radius of his expensive cologne. "The industry is changing. Some people are just too blinded by their own reflection to see the storm coming." He didn't even look at her as she walked away. He was too busy regaling a reporter with a story about his latest acquisition, his voice dripping with the entitlement of a man who believed he had already won. As Alexandra moved toward the exit, she passed Sarah. The younger woman reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she offered a damp cloth. "I'm so sorry, Miss Blake," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting toward Arthur to ensure he wasn't watching. "He shouldn't have done that." "Not after everything he took from you." Alexandra took the cloth, but she didn't use it on the dress. She wiped a single drop of wine from her hand, her expression unreadable. "Don't be sorry, Sarah. He's just reminding me why I came back." She stepped out of the ballroom and into the cool, quiet air of the hallway. The sound of the party faded behind the heavy oak doors, replaced by the soft click of her heels on the marble floor. She pulled her phone from her bag. The screen was dark, save for a single notification from an untraceable server. Phase 1, verification complete. Target is over-leveraged. Asset seizure protocols ready on your command. Alexandra looked at the time. It was 9:15 p.m. In exactly 48 hours, Arthur Morgan would be standing in this same building for the annual shareholders' meeting. He expected a coronation. She walked toward the elevators, her reflection in the polished brass doors showing a woman who looked nothing like the disgraced heiress the papers had mocked 5 years ago. The wine stain was still there, a dark mark against the cream silk, but she wore it like a badge of office. "Arthur," she murmured to the empty hallway, her voice cold and certain. "I hope you enjoyed the wine. It's the last thing you're ever going to take from me." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. She stepped inside, the light from the hallway casting her shadow long and sharp across the floor. As the doors began to close, she reached out and pressed the button for the penthouse. The floor Arthur thought he owned, but the floor her company had quietly purchased through a shell corporation 3 weeks ago. The countdown had begun. One more day of his arrogance. One more day of his lies. And then, the world would see exactly what happens when the lion finally stops sleeping. The scent of expensive cedarwood and aged bourbon hit Alexandra Blake the moment she stepped out of the elevator. It was a smell that used to mean home, but now it only signaled the presence of a predator. She didn't look at the wine stain on her cream silk dress. She didn't have to. She could feel the dampness against her skin, a cold reminder of the man waiting just past the double mahogany doors. Arthur Morgan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette framed by the city skyline he believed he conquered daily. He didn't turn when she entered. He simply swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, mocking sound. "I told security to keep the service staff in the kitchen," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He finally turned, his eyes raking over her with blatant disrespect. "But I suppose you always did have a habit of showing up where you weren't invited, Alexandra." Thomas Morgan sat on the edge of the glass desk, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He looked like a cheaper, softer version of his father, lacking the sharp edges but possessing twice the malice. "Maybe she's here for the cleaning position, Dad. She's already got the uniform for it." He gestured toward the dark purple blotch on her chest and let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Alexandra didn't flinch. She walked toward the center of the room, her heels clicking against the high-gloss marble with a steady, military precision. She noticed Sarah standing near the filing cabinets, her head down, clutching a stack of folders. The young assistant's knuckles were white, her eyes darting toward Alexandra with a mixture of pity and terror. "I'm not here for a job, Arthur," she said, her voice like a sheet of ice. "Then why are you here?" Arthur stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of arrogance and expensive tobacco. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the stain on her dress. "You look pathetic, like a fallen queen trying to beg for her throne back. It's embarrassing, really, even for someone with your history." "I'm here to give you a courtesy," Alexandra replied. She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a slim black device. To anyone else, it looked like a high-end smartphone. To her, it was a gateway. She tapped the screen, and for a split second, the biometric scanner on the wall behind Arthur's desk flashed a subtle emerald green. He was too busy sneering to notice the system acknowledging its true owner. "A courtesy," Thomas barked another laugh. "Is that what they call begging these days? Look at you. You're wearing a knockoff watch and a ruined dress. You're a ghost, Alexandra Blake, and ghosts don't have any business in the real world." Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Since you're here, be useful. My shoes took a bit of a splash when I dropped that glass on you. Buff them out before you crawl back to whatever hole you've been hiding in. Maybe I'll find a few dollars in my pocket for the trouble." The rage spiked in her chest, hot and sharp, but she funneled it into the cold reservoir of her resolve. She looked past him at the clock on the wall. 24 hours. 24 hours, Arthur, she murmured. "Is that a threat?" He laughed, the sound echoing off the cold stone walls. "What are you going to do in 24 hours? File a complaint? Call the press? Nobody cares about the girl who burned her own legacy down. Her phone vibrated in her hand, a message from Jerome Wilson. The board is confirmed for tomorrow morning, 9:00 a.m. They have no idea what's coming. Alexandra met Arthur's gaze, her eyes steady and unblinking. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just telling you to enjoy the view while you still can. The air is much thinner where you're going. She turned on her heel, leaving the room before he could respond. She didn't need to see his confusion or hear Thomas's parting insult. As she reached the elevator, she saw Sarah watch her go, a spark of something, hope, perhaps, flickering in the assistant's eyes. The elevator doors slid shut, and Alexandra pulled out her phone, dialing a number she had memorized years ago. Jerome, she said as the call connected. Everything is in place. He's as arrogant as we hoped. He won't see the floor falling out from under him until he's already in the basement. She looked at her reflection in the polished metal of the elevator doors. The wine stain was still there, but it no longer felt like a mark of shame. It felt like the opening bell of a war Arthur Morgan had already lost. Tomorrow, she whispered to the empty car. Tomorrow, the lion wakes up. The glass doors of Wilson Biotech hissed, shut behind Alexandra Blake, cutting off the humid roar of the city. Here, the air tasted of ozone and expensive filtration, a stark contrast to the stagnant, perfume-heavy atmosphere of her father's old boardroom. She didn't pause at the reception desk. She didn't need to. The security scanners chirped a rhythmic greeting, recognizing her biometric signature before she even reached the elevator bank. Jerome Wilson was waiting for her on the penthouse floor. He stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette sharp against the twilight skyline. The veteran CEO didn't turn immediately. He was watching the lights of the Morgan Pharmaceuticals building flicker to life 3 blocks away. You're late, Jerome said, though his voice lacked any edge. He turned, offering a thin, knowing smile. I assume Arthur Morgan was as charming as the rumors suggest. Alexandra moved to the mahogany desk, her heels clicking with a predatory precision on the polished stone. He's worse. He's comfortable. He thinks the wine stain he put on my dress today is the highlight of his week. She reached into her bag and pulled out an encrypted drive, sliding it across the desk. He has no idea it was the distraction I needed to bypass his internal server. Jerome picked up the drive, his eyes glinting with professional respect. The Nexus trap. If this works, Alexandra, you won't just be taking back your father's legacy. You'll be dismantling the Morgan name brick by brick. It's already working, she replied, her voice low and steady. He thinks he's finalizing the merger with Wilson Biotech tomorrow. He thinks you're his lifeline. He doesn't realize you're the anchor that's going to pull him under. Across town, the atmosphere was far less clinical. Arthur Morgan leaned back in a tufted leather chair at the Vanguard, an exclusive club where the membership dues cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He swirled a glass of 30-year-old scotch, the amber liquid catching the light of the fireplace. She actually looked like she was going to cry, Thomas Morgan chuckled, lounging on the sofa opposite his father. Thomas adjusted his silk tie, his face flushed with the easy confidence of a man who had never earned a single thing in his life. The way she just stood there with that red stain on her chest. It was poetic, Dad, truly. Arthur let out a dry, rasping laugh. Alexandra always had her father's pride, but none of his sense. She thinks showing up with a few patents and a chip on her shoulder makes her a player. She's a ghost, Thomas, and ghosts don't win board battles. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing. Tomorrow, when Jerome signs the Nexus agreement, we'll absorb her remaining holdings as part of the collateral. She'll be lucky if I leave her enough to buy a bus ticket out of the city. Arthur pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. I think a final parting gift is in order, just so she knows exactly where she stands before the hammer falls. Back in the quiet sanctuary of the Wilson Biotech office, Alexandra's phone buzzed on the desk. She didn't pick it up. She didn't have to. The notification preview glowed in the dim light. It was a digital receipt for a $500 transfer to her personal account. The memo line read, for a new dress, try to find something that doesn't scream desperate. AM. Jerome glanced at the screen and then back at her. He's baiting you. He wants you emotional for the meeting tomorrow." "He wants a reaction," Alexandra said, her expression unreadable. She walked to the window, looking down at the grid of the city. "He's spent years treating people like footnotes in his biography. He thinks wealth is a shield, and he thinks my silence is a surrender." She felt the weight of the moment. The years of exile, the quiet nights spent building her own empire under a pseudonym, the meticulous planning required to turn Arthur's own greed against him. The nexus wasn't just a business deal. It was a financial kill switch buried in the fine print of a predatory loan Arthur had taken out to keep Morgan Pharmaceuticals afloat during the last quarter. By signing the merger tomorrow, Arthur would be unknowingly handing the keys to his entire kingdom to a holding company he didn't realize Alexandra controlled. "Is the press corps ready?" Alexandra asked, not turning around. "Sarah has handled the logistics," Jerome confirmed. "They'll be in the lobby of the Morgan building at 10 a.m. sharp. They expect a routine merger announcement. They have no idea they're about to witness a public execution." Alexandra reached out, her fingers brushing the cool glass of the window. In the reflection, she saw the wine stain again, but it looked different now. It didn't look like a mark of humiliation. It looked like a target. "Thomas will be there," Jerome reminded her. "He'll try to make a scene." "Let him," Alexandra whispered. "The bigger the audience, the louder the fall." She picked up her phone, finally addressing the message. She didn't type a reply. Instead, she hit the decline button on the transfer, sending the money back to Arthur's account with a single-word attachment. "Keep it. You're going to need the change." She turned to Jerome, her eyes cold and bright. "Tomorrow morning, I want the first thing Arthur sees when he walks into that boardroom to be the one thing he fears most." "And what's that?" Jerome asked. Alexandra's smile didn't reach her eyes. "The truth." She walked toward the exit, her mind already moving through the opening moves of the next day. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back at the darkened office. The countdown had begun. In less than 12 hours, the Morgan name would be a footnote, and the sleeping lion would finally be finished with its rest. The elevator doors closed, the silent descent feeling like the intake of breath before a scream. Tomorrow wasn't just a meeting. It was a reckoning. And Alexandra Blake was ready to collect every cent of the debt she was owed. Alexandra Blake stood in the lobby of Morgan Pharmaceuticals, the air smelling of industrial lavender and the sharp, metallic tang of filtered air. She adjusted the cuff of her charcoal blazer, her fingers brushing against the heavy, solid gold watch that had once belonged to her grandfather. It was a relic of a time before the rot had set in, a weight that grounded her, while the glass and steel temple of her father's legacy hummed around her. "You're early for your exit interview, Alexandra." She didn't need to turn to recognize the voice. Arthur Morgan's tone always carried the same oily self-assurance, the sound of a man who believed the world was a series of doors waiting for him to kick them open. He stepped beside her, his reflection in the polished black marble wall sharp and predatory. He looked every bit the titan in his bespoke suit, a silk pocket square peeking out from his breast pocket like a taunt. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Arthur," she replied. Her voice was a low, steady contrast to the morning bustle of the lobby. Arthur let out a short, bark-like laugh. He signaled for the executive elevator, the chime echoing through the cavernous space like a funeral bell. "I saw the transfer rejection, bold, or perhaps just stupid. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, even when you were a child playing in the boardrooms you didn't understand." "I understand them now," she said, stepping into the elevator. Arthur followed, the doors sliding shut with a hiss that felt like a seal being broken. He didn't look at her. Instead, he checked his reflection in the mirrored doors, smoothing his hair with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no. "Thomas told me you were seen with Jerome Wilson. Desperate move. Jerome is a relic, a man who values ethics over earnings. He can't save you from the vote today. By noon, the Morgan name will be scrubbed from your identity for good." Alexandra felt the slight pull of gravity as the lift ascended. She watched the floor numbers ticking upward, her reflection staring back at her with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by a man in an expensive suit. "You talk a lot about legacy, Arthur, but a legacy built on sand doesn't just wash away. It collapses. He turned to her then, his eyes narrowing. The arrogance was still there, but a flicker of irritation crossed his face, a small fissure in his granite ego. Is that a threat? From a woman who couldn't even keep her own office. You're a ghost, Alexandra. A shadow of a name that I've made profitable. You should have taken the money and disappeared. Now you'll leave with nothing but the clothes on your back. I'm not here for the money, she said, her voice dropping an octave, cold as a winter grave. I'm here for the truth, and the truth is very expensive. Arthur snorted, the sound dripping with contempt. The truth is whatever the board says it is, and they say I'm the savior of this company. The elevator reached the top floor with a soft, electronic chime. As the doors opened, Sarah stood there, a stack of folders clutched to her chest. Her eyes widened when she saw Alexandra. The assistant looked between the two of them, her knuckles white against the manila paper. She had seen the way Alexandra looked now, not like the disgraced girl who had been escorted out 5 years ago, but like a predator who had finally caught the scent of blood. Mr. Morgan, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The board is waiting and there are people downstairs, the press corps. They say they were invited to a special announcement. Arthur stiffened, his hand tightening on the handle of his leather briefcase until the stitching groaned. The press, who authorized that? He shot a look at Alexandra, his lip curling in a snarl. You're doing a pathetic attempt at a PR stunt. It won't work. Security will have them out in 5 minutes. I didn't invite them to a stunt, Arthur, Alexandra said, stepping past him onto the plush executive carpet. The scent of expensive floor wax and old power was suffocating, but she didn't flinch. I invited them to a funeral. You just haven't realized whose it is yet. Thomas Morgan emerged from the boardroom at the end of the hall, his face pale, his tie slightly crooked. He looked at his sister, then at Arthur, his mouth working but no sound coming out. He was the enabler, the brother who had watched the theft of her life and stayed silent for a corner office. Arthur, Thomas managed to choke out, his voice thin. We need to talk. Now. Arthur brushed him off with a flick of his hand. Later, Thomas, I have a company to finalize. He turned back to Alexandra, his face a mask of cold fury. This is your last warning. Walk away now, or I will bury you so deep even your name won't be able to find you. Alexandra didn't answer. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. She held it up, the light catching the silver casing. See you inside, Arthur. She walked toward the boardroom doors, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the floor. Behind her, she could hear Arthur's heavy, agitated breathing and the frantic whispering of her brother. The countdown wasn't in hours anymore. It was in seconds. Alexandra reached for the heavy oak handle, her pulse calm, her mind sharp. The doors opened, revealing the long table of witnesses waiting for the show to begin. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung shut with a thud that echoed like a gavel. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive mahogany polish and the bitter, over-extracted aroma of high-end espresso. 12 members of the board sat around the sprawling table, their faces obscured by the blue-white glow of their tablets. At the head of the table, Arthur Morgan looked like a king on a precarious throne. He didn't stand when Alexandra entered. He didn't even stop swirling the ice in his glass. He simply looked at her, his eyes traveling from her sensible shoes to her calm, unbothered expression, and let out a short, barking laugh. I see the security team is as incompetent as the woman they let through the door, he said, his voice carrying that practiced, boardroom resonance. He turned to the men on his left. Gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. My sister has always had a difficult time distinguishing between a private business meeting and a cry for attention. Alexandra didn't flinch. She felt the cool, metallic weight of the thumb drive pressed against her palm, a secret anchor in a room designed to make her feel small. She moved toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, opposite him. Sarah was already there, standing near the AV hub with a laptop open. Her former assistant didn't look up, but her fingers were steady on the keys. I'm not here for attention, Arthur, Alexandra said, her voice a sharp contrast to his bluster. It was quiet, steady, and carried to every corner of the room. I'm here as a primary stakeholder in the merger you're about to propose. Thomas Morgan, seated to Arthur's right, let out a strangled sound that was half cough, half sob. He was sweating, his silk tie suddenly looking 3 sizes too small for his neck. He looked at his brother, his eyes pleading for a way out of the room, but Arthur was too busy leaning back in his leather chair, which creaked under his weight. "Stakeholder," Arthur sneered, his lip curling in a way that made the board members shift uncomfortably. "You haven't held a stake in this company since the day Father realized you were a liability. You're a ghost, Alexandra, a memory of a failure. Now, leave before I have the police escort you out in front of the press corps waiting downstairs. It would be a shame to ruin that modest little outfit with a set of handcuffs." The room remained silent. Jerome Wilson, the veteran CEO of Wilson Biotech, sat 3 seats down from Arthur. He hadn't joined in the laughter. Instead, he was watching Alexandra with an intensity that made the air feel electric. He noticed the way she didn't look at the empty chairs or the expensive art on the walls. She looked only at Arthur with the predatory patience of someone who had already won. "Let her stay," Jerome said, his voice gravelly and final. Arthur's head snapped toward him. "Jerome, this is a family matter. We have a schedule to keep." "I don't care about your family drama, Arthur," Jerome replied, tapping a blunt finger against the table. "I care about the fact that this woman just walked into a room full of the most powerful people in the industry and didn't blink. If she says she's a stakeholder, I want to see the paperwork. If she's lying, we can all watch her get arrested together. Either way, it's the most interesting thing to happen in this room all morning." Arthur's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He looked back at Alexandra, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Fine. You want to play at being a businesswoman. You have 5 minutes to present whatever delusion you've brought with you. But know this. Once those 5 minutes are up, I will personally ensure you never work in this city again. I'll blackball you so thoroughly you'll be lucky to find a job cleaning the floors of the buildings you used to own." Alexandra walked toward the head of the table. Every step was a calculated beat. She could hear the hum of the projector cooling fan as it kicked into high gear, a low-frequency buzz that felt like a countdown. She reached Sarah, who handed her the connector cable. "The 5 minutes are for your benefit, Arthur, not mine," Alexandra said. She leaned over the table, her face inches from his. She could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the faint, metallic scent of his rising panic. "I wanted to give you one last chance to resign quietly. To tell the board that you're stepping down for personal reasons before the floor falls out from under you." Arthur leaned in, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You have nothing. You're a disgraced heiress with a plastic drive and a grudge. You think these people care about the truth. They care about the bottom line, and I am the bottom line." Alexandra straightened up, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. She didn't answer him. Instead, she turned to the board, her gaze lingering on Jerome Wilson for a second longer than the others. "Gentlemen, Thomas, and the rest of you. You are here to vote on the acquisition of Morgan Pharmaceuticals by Wilson Biotech. You've been told the company is a fortress. You've been told the patents are secure and the books are clean." She plugged the drive into the port. On the massive screen behind Arthur, a loading icon began to swirl. "I'm here to show you the cracks in the foundation," she continued, "and the man who's been selling you the rubble." Thomas stood up suddenly, his chair screeching against the marble floor. "Arthur, we should go now. We can reschedule." "Sit down, Thomas," Arthur roared, slamming his hand onto the table. The water in Jerome's glass rippled from the impact. Arthur turned his fury back to the screen. "Show them, then. Show them your little PowerPoint. Show them your lies. I'm going to enjoy watching you crumble." Alexandra's finger hovered over the laptop's trackpad. The room was so quiet she could hear the ticking of Arthur's gold watch. She looked him directly in the eye, her thumb drive glowing a steady, rhythmic blue in the dim light. "I'm not showing them a PowerPoint, Arthur," she whispered. "I'm showing them the audit." She clicked the button. The screen flickered, then filled with a high-resolution scan of a document that Thomas Morgan recognized instantly. His face went the color of ash. Arthur's smirk didn't vanish, it froze, his features locking into a mask of confusion that was slowly, painfully beginning to crack. The first line of the document was highlighted in bright, lethal yellow. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a confession. "Let's start with the 9 o'clock execution," Alexandra said, her voice echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence of the room. "And let's see who really owns the chair you're sitting in." The high-resolution scan on the wall-sized monitor was more than just a financial record. It was a death warrant for Arthur's reputation. The room, previously filled with the hum of self-importance and the clinking of expensive pens, plummeted into a silence so heavy it felt physical. Alexandra Blake stood perfectly still, her silhouette sharp against the glowing evidence. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at him. "This is a forgery," Arthur Morgan stammered, his voice cracking, losing its practiced baritone. He looked around the table, desperate for a friendly face. "Thomas, tell them, this is some desperate stunt from a girl who couldn't handle the real world." Thomas Morgan didn't answer. He was staring at the signature at the bottom of page 4, the jagged, unmistakable M that had authorized the offshore transfers. His face had gone the color of wet parchment, his eyes wide and blinking rapidly behind his designer frames. He looked at his father, then quickly looked away, the betrayal of his own incompetence finally sinking in. "Forgery." Alexandra's voice was a whisper, yet it carried to the back of the room where the press corps stood with their cameras forgotten in their hands. "The audit was conducted by Wilson Biotech's own compliance team, Arthur. Jerome, perhaps you'd like to confirm the validity of the digital watermark." Jerome Wilson leaned forward, his silver hair catching the blue light of the projector. He adjusted his glasses, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to a cold, hard disgust. "The encryption is verified, Alexandra. This document is an original from the Morgan internal server. It's authentic, and it's damning." Arthur's jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O. The ruddy, self-assured flush that usually defined his cheeks vanished, replaced by a sickly, grayish pallor that made him look 20 years older in an instant. His eyes, once sharp with predatory arrogance, became glassy and unfocused, darting frantically toward the screen as if the words might change if he stared hard enough. A single bead of sweat broke from his hairline, carving a slow, glistening path through the deep furrows of his forehead before trembling on his eyebrow. His hands, which had been so steady while mocking her earlier, were now vibrating against the mahogany table, making his heavy gold rings chatter against the wood like chattering teeth. He looked like a man watching his own execution in high definition. "You're fired," he hissed, a last pathetic gasp of the man he used to be. "I'll have security throw you out of this building." "That's the thing about the 9 o'clock execution, Arthur," she said, stepping closer to him. The scent of his expensive cologne was now masked by the sharp, metallic tang of his panic. "You thought you were stealing my father's company that night. You thought you deburied the evidence of the fraud you used to force his hand. But you forgot that I was in the room. I was always in the room." She reached into her folder and pulled out a single, embossed card. She didn't throw it. She placed it gently on the table in front of him. "I didn't just come here to show you the audit," she said. "I came to introduce the new owner. As of 8 a.m. this morning, Blake Holdings acquired the majority of your outstanding debt. Your creditors didn't want a sinking ship, Arthur. They wanted a winner." Sarah, standing by the door, let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips as she caught Alexandra's eye, a silent acknowledgement of the years of shared silence. The press corps finally found their rhythm, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of shutters firing like a firing squad. Arthur tried to stand, but his knees seemed to have turned to water. He slumped back into the leather chair, the chair he had once told her she was too small to fill. "You said I didn't belong in this room," Alexandra said, her voice devoid of heat, which made it all the more terrifying. "You were right. I don't belong in a room filled with thieves, which is why you have 10 minutes to clear your desk before the forensic team arrives." She turned to Jerome and Sarah, nodding once with the quiet authority of a woman who had already moved on to the next move. "Jerome, the board meeting is adjourned. "Sarah, please ensure the authorities have the full digital trail." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch him crumble further or listen to the excuses that were already bubbling up in his throat. She walked toward the double doors, the sound of her heels on the marble floor steady and rhythmic, echoing through the boardroom like a heartbeat. She reached the door and paused, looking back one last time at the man who had tried to destroy her. He was a small, gray figure silhouetted against the evidence of his own greed. Oh, and Arthur. She added, her hand on the cold brass handle. The gold watch, it was part of the collateral. Leave it on the desk. She stepped out into the hallway, the doors swinging shut behind her with a heavy, final thud. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft, pneumatic hiss, cutting off the frantic shouting from the boardroom. Alexandra Blake stood alone in the mirrored box, her reflection steady and sharp against the brushed steel. She didn't look like a woman who had just dismantled an empire. She looked like someone who had finally finished a tedious chore. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint, mechanical hum of the descent and the rhythmic thumping of her own heart. She adjusted her cuff, her fingers brushing the cool skin of her wrist. The air in the elevator smelled faintly of ozone and expensive floor wax, a sterile scent that felt like a palate cleanser after the suffocating ego of the floor above. When the doors chimed and opened into the grand marble lobby, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The press corps was already there, a sea of camera lenses and microphones held like spears. They had been tipped off, though not by her. Word of a corporate execution traveled faster than light in this city. "Alexandra, is it true?" a reporter shouted, the flash of a camera blooming like a white star in her peripheral vision. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps echoed from the marble stairs behind her. Arthur Morgan had ignored the elevator, opting to chase her down the stairs in a desperate, lung-bursting sprint. He burst into the lobby, his tie askew and his face a terrifying shade of purple. "Stop her!" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "She's a thief. She's stealing the company." The lobby went unnaturally still. The reporters pivoted as one, their lenses tracking the man who had spent 3 decades, cultivated an image of untouchable dignity. Arthur's features seemed to be melting under the heat of the lobby's spotlights. The arrogance that usually sat like a mask on his face had cracked, revealing a hollow, gray terror beneath. His eyes, usually sharp with cold calculation, were now glassy and dilated, darting toward the security guards as if they could save him from the truth. A thin sheen of cold sweat broke across his upper lip, and his jaw hung slightly slack, making him look aged and diminished. Every time he tried to speak, his throat bobbed convulsively, but only a dry, rattling sound emerged, as if the very air in the room had become too thin for a man of his ego to breathe. He looked less like a CEO and more like a ghost witnessing his own funeral. Thomas Morgan stumbled out behind his father, looking pale and nauseated. He reached for Arthur's arm, perhaps to steady him or perhaps to pull him away from the cameras, but his father shoved him back with a snarl. "Don't touch me, you useless brat," Arthur hissed, though the microphones caught every syllable. He turned his venom back to the woman standing calmly by the revolving doors. "You think those documents mean anything? I built this. I am Morgan Pharmaceuticals." "You were Arthur," a new voice boomed. Jerome Wilson stepped forward from the shadows of the pillars, his expression one of grim disappointment. He held a tablet in his hand, the screen glowing with the live feed of the stock market. "The board has already held an emergency vote via the secure portal. In light of the evidence of embezzlement and the illegal clinical trial cover-ups, your C-suite access has been revoked, effective 4 minutes ago." Sarah stood a few paces behind Jerome, her arms crossed. She wasn't the timid assistant anymore. She watched Arthur with a look of clinical detachment, the way one might observe a specimen under a microscope. When Arthur's eyes met hers, pleading for some vestige of the loyalty he thought he had bought, she simply looked away. The cameras captured it all, the moment the king realized his crown was made of glass. "This is a setup," Arthur whispered, his knees buckling slightly. He looked at the press corps, his hands trembling. "She's lying. Alexandra Blake is a disgraced heiress. I'm the majority shareholder, Alexandra said, her voice low but carrying through the silent lobby like a bell. And as of this moment, you're trespassing on private property. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single, heavy folder. She didn't hand it to Arthur. She handed it to the lead reporter from the Financial Times. Inside, you'll find the offshore account numbers and the signed directives for the falsified data, she said calmly. Everything the authorities will need to complete the trail Jerome started. Arthur lunged forward, a desperate, clumsy move to grab the folder, but two security guards, men who had been on his payroll for a decade, stepped into his path. They didn't move for him, they moved against him. The betrayal in his eyes was visceral. He was a man who believed money bought reality, and he was finally discovering that reality had a much higher price. Alexandra didn't stay to watch him fall. She didn't need to see the handcuffs that Sarah was already signaling for at the edge of the room. She turned toward the glass doors, the cold winter air rushing in to meet her. "Alexandra!" Thomas called out, his voice small and pathetic. "What are we supposed to do?" She paused, her hand on the cold metal handle of the door. She didn't look back at the wreckage of the Morgan family. She looked out at the city, where the lights were just beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk. "You should have thought about that before you decided I was small enough to crush," she said. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The sound of her heels on the concrete was the only thing she heard as she walked toward the waiting black car. Behind her, the shouting of the press and the frantic denials of a broken man faded into a dull, insignificant roar. As the car pulled away from the curb, Alexandra caught a glimpse of Arthur in the rearview mirror. He was being led toward a side exit, his head bowed, his expensive wool coat looking far too heavy for his slumped shoulders. He looked small. He looked finished. She leaned back against the leather seat, the tension finally draining from her shoulders. It was over. The empire had crumbled, and the dust was settling. But as she watched the Morgan building disappear into the skyline, her phone buzzed in her hand. It was an encrypted message from an unknown number. "The accounts are drained, but the ledger is incomplete." He wasn't working alone. Alexandra stared at the screen, her pulse quickening again. The victory felt suddenly fragile, like ice beginning to crack underfoot. She looked back at the towering glass monolith she had just left, realizing that the man she had destroyed was only the beginning of the rot. 6 months had passed since the glass walls of the Morgan Empire shattered into a million jagged pieces. The scandal had been a slow-motion car crash that the public couldn't stop watching. But for Alexandra Blake, the roar of the crowd had finally faded into a purposeful, rhythmic silence. She stood on the private terrace of the new Blake Wilson headquarters, the scent of damp pavement and expensive jasmine tea swirling around her in the crisp morning air. She didn't wear the modest, blending-in suits of her exile anymore. Today, she wore a structured blazer of deep navy wool, the fabric so fine it felt like a second skin. On her left wrist, a vintage Patek Philippe ticked with a steady, relentless precision, the only item she had reclaimed from the wreckage of her father's original collection. Jerome Wilson stepped onto the terrace, the ice clinking softly in his glass. It was a sound that used to signal a boardroom battle, but now it only accompanied a quiet, earned celebration. Sarah followed him, no longer the timid assistant who lived in fear of a billionaire's whims, but the newly appointed director of communications. She carried a tablet that glowed with the morning's headlines. "The final audit is officially signed," Jerome said, his voice a warm gravel. "The Morgan name has been scrubbed from the last of the patents. It's all Blake Wilson now, Alexandra. The industry has a new North Star." Sarah tapped the screen, showing the lead story in the Financial Times. "The press corps is calling it the Blake Restoration. They're demanding an interview for the Sunday magazine. They want to know how it feels to be the most powerful woman in the sector." Alexandra looked out at the skyline, her eyes finding the distant, darkened silhouette of the old Morgan building. "Tell them I'm too busy building a future that doesn't rely on shadows to talk about the past." 3 miles away, in a windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and unwashed desperation, Arthur Morgan sat beneath the hum of a flickering fluorescent light. The cheap, mechanical buzz was a constant, grating reminder of everything he had lost. His suit was the same charcoal silk he'd worn to his final board meeting, but it hung off his frame now, the shoulders slumped and the lapels dusted with ash. A dark stain, the size of a coin, sat mockingly on his silk tie. He wasn't the lion anymore. He was a scavenger caught in the harsh glare of a legal spotlight. Across from him, the federal prosecutors laid out the incomplete ledger Alexandra had delivered, the final piece of the puzzle that linked his offshore accounts to a systematic raiding of her mother's estate. "I built that company with my bare hands," Arthur snapped, his voice cracking with a high, thin edge of panic. The old entitlement flickered in his eyes, a dying ember in a cold hearth. "Alexandra is a vulture. She didn't win. She stole my legacy. She's destroyed the family name just to satisfy her own petty spite." The lead prosecutor didn't even look up from the documents. "Mr. Morgan, the only thing your daughter did was stop the theft you started 20 years ago. Your son, Thomas Morgan, has already signed the plea deal. He's given us the encrypted keys to the remaining shell companies. He's not interested in protecting your legacy anymore." The mention of Thomas hit the room like a physical chill. Arthur's mouth opened, then closed, his throat working as he tried to find a retort that didn't exist. He looked small. He looked finished. The man who had once commanded thousands was now struggling to command his own breathing. In her office, Alexandra sat at a desk of polished obsidian. The victory was absolute, the justice proportional. Arthur was facing a decade in a federal facility, his wealth seized, his reputation a cautionary tale of hubris. But the cost sat on her desk in the form of a single framed photograph she hadn't yet been able to put away. It showed her and Thomas as children, playing in a garden that no longer existed. She had seen Thomas a week ago, through the thick glass of a visitor's partition. He hadn't looked at her with rage, but with a hollow, terrifying blankness that was far worse. He had been the enabler, the weak link in their father's chain, and now he was a ghost of a man, broken by the weight of a power he never truly possessed. She had reclaimed her empire, but the family she had once hoped to save was gone, scattered like ash in the wind. Alexandra picked up a small, hand-carved wooden lion, a toy from her childhood, the only thing Arthur hadn't been able to sell or destroy. She set it on the edge of her glass desk, overlooking the city she now helped lead. Justice tasted like cold champagne, crisp, expensive, and undeniably bitter. She was the queen of the mountain, but as she watched the sun catch the gold leaf on the surrounding towers, she realized the mountain was made of ice. The ledger was closed, the debt was paid, and for the first time in her life, the sleeping lion was finally at peace.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.